Join the Snoqualmie Valley Museum for our Snoqualmie Valley History 101 series. This video we will learn more about the development of industry in the Snoqualmie Valley during the late 1800s and early 1900s. The arrival of the railway in 1889 changed everything. The Snoqualmie Valley offered a wide array of natural resources that could be exploited once transportation systems were in place. After the immediate needs of nearby communities were met, much of the agricultural and industrial production was geared towards the export market, as the region's initial population was relatively small. These industries provided a focus for new settlement as workers generally made their homes near their jobs. In some cases these settlements were ephemeral and consisted of camps or crude shacks and cabins that were in use only until an area was logged or a prospect played out. Other settlements were built for permanence, sometimes as company towns to ensure workers remained near their jobs, but sometimes at a crossroads or transportation hub. A variety of community institutions, schools, churches, stores, and social organizations brought an element of stability. However, without a nearby industry or market for their products, even some of these more organized communities eventually disappeared. Railroads exponentially expanded logging, mining, and farming. Ancient forests were cut down within a few generations, hillsides were physically altered by mining, and rivers were rerouted for farming. Vast tracts of merchantable timber became available through the sale of railroad land grants, and by the early 1900s, several large lumber companies had also moved into the region, seeking new opportunities as Midwestern reserves dwindled. Frederick Weyerhaeuser's purchase of 90,000 acres of northern Pacific land in 1900 dwarfed subsequent transactions, and the Weyerhaeuser Syndicate purchased existing mills or built new ones. Independent logging ventures snapped up as many of the railroad holdings as they could, and also sought to log homestead and timber claims owned by individuals, as well as to purchase government timber sales. By 1910, Washington had become the country's top lumber producer, with nearly 63% of the state's workers dependent on the forest industry for jobs. The capacity of a train to haul raw logs from a hillside to a mill far exceeded what had been possible with a horse or oxen. Similar economies were realized in coal mines and throughout the mining industry. The rail network allowed products to be shipped to markets outside the Northwest. Before the arrival of railroads, logging was restricted to areas near a body of water. Animals were used to drag the cut trees to the river or lake. Oxen were the most popular but did not have nearly the pulling power of a locomotive. For most of the early decades of King County's growth, the timber industry dominated the economy. In particular, the county's huge stands of Douglas fir attracted the interest of lumbermen, and with the advent of better transportation systems, exploitation of this species continued to lead the expansion of the industry. Over time, the industry grew and made the county one of the largest producers in the state. Issaquah historian Eric Erickson documented nearly 1,500 timber-related businesses that operated in King County between 1853 and 2001, and likely there were many more that were short-lived or subsumed under other corporate names. In many cases, these businesses were associated with settlements or provided jobs that attracted a wide array of newcomers from across the United States and the world. Early logging methods of the period typically relied on timber sources along the shoreline. As loggers were forced to range farther inland for access to logs, some of the larger mill owners began to buy up timberland to supply their operations. Several of these millmen were among the largest purchasers of King County land, and their crews logged large swaths of its heavily forested sections. During this period, the valley was filled with mammoth trees. Typical trees were 15 feet in diameter and over 250 feet tall as Snoqualmie Falls. Larger trees were known to be over 30 feet in diameter and 300 feet tall. Before the arrival of the railroads, trees this size could only be moved by oxen, horses, or the river, so logging was limited to areas close to a mill. Logging began in 1873 when the Watson Allen Mill opened downstream from Snoqualmie Falls at Tokal Creek. Watson Allen began his sawmill venture on Tokal Creek, near the settlement that became Falls City. Allen put in a dam and channeled the water through a flume and mill race to power his mill. He produced squared timbers and other products, employing local native workers who manned various parts of the sawmill operation. Within 5 years, approximately 12 logging operations were active along the Snoqualmie River, utilizing the river to transport logs downstream. The Seattle Lake Shore and Eastern Railway, in particular, had a significant impact on the development of logging in the areas north of Seattle, as well as around Lake Sammamish and up the Snoqualmie River Valley. Sources suggest that much of the logging in northern King County between Lake Washington and Puget Sound primarily took place during the 1890s and early 20th century, once these rail lines were in place. The SLS&E also built some of its own milling facilities at crucial locations, and then, once construction was completed, often moved these mills or sold them to individuals. An example was an early Issaquah mill that produced lumber for railroad trestles and was then sold to Joe Donlin, brother of Anne Donlin Maloney, wife of the first mayor of North Bend, Peter Maloney, son of homesteader Michael Donlin, possibly in 1891. As a result of the availability of rail transport for marketing, the number of logging and milling operations throughout the county greatly expanded. By 1910, for example, there were 3 lumber mills and 6 shingle mills within 4 miles of Issaquah, and these plants were the focus of growing settlements at High Point, Preston, and Monohan. Several logging railroads also helped to move timber from the forests on both sides of Lake Sammamish, Tiger Mountain, and Grand Ridge to these mills for processing. The Preston mill employed as many as 200 men, many of whom were recent immigrants from Sweden. Preston became attractive to the lumber industry in 1891 when it was reached by the railroad. In Seattle, a young Swedish Baptist immigrant, August Lovgren, experienced in construction and lumber manufacturing, witnessed the growing demand for cedar shingles in the aftermath of the Great Seattle Fire of 1889. Lovgren acquired 80 acres of cedar in Preston and convinced other Swedes to help him finance the construction of a shingle mill, thereby founding the Preston Mill Company. He successfully acquired additional land and constructed 2 new lumber mills, one for producing cedar shingles and a second for manufacturing finished lumber from fir. He built a mill upstream along Lake Creek, where it joins the raging river. This mill was used to cut rough logs into smaller pieces, which were then sent down his 2.5-mile lumber flume to the finishing mills below. The town that grew around the rough-cut mill became Upper Preston. Lovgren recruited workers from Sweden and attracted Swedes already in King County. As the company flourished, he added a company store, a boarding house, and houses for workers. The town strongly reflected Swedish culture, with church services held in Swedish. In 1910, Lovgren sold his majority interest to Swedish industrialist C.J. Eriksson, who added a hotel and community center. In 1932, the sawmill in Upper Preston was destroyed by flood and fire. The mill company stayed in the Eriksson family for decades, then went through several new owners with mixed results. Today, it is a King County park. Snoqualmie Mill Company, known variously as Warren and Hardy Mill, Warren and Irving Mill, Snoqualmie Mill Company, Snoqualmie Logging Company, and Snoqualmie Lumber Company, operated from the 1880s until it burned down in 1913. Incorporated September 9, 1897, as Snoqualmie Logging Company. Although the Snoqualmie Hop Ranch had its own mill, this was the first significant mill run in the Upper Valley. It was located across the river from town, at the future Snoqualmie Falls Lumber Company mill site. The mill pond was an old Snoqualmie River oxbow that was later expanded by the Snoqualmie Falls Lumber Company in 1916. The company that would come to be known as the North Bend Timber Company was incorporated in 1906 by William C. Weeks and Robert Webb Vinage. W. C. Weeks worked for pioneers Guston and Tibbetts when he arrived from the east in 1889, then bought their general merchandise store, bought local house property and timberland, and by 1909 was a partner in the North Bend Lumber Company. That same year, they incorporated the North Bend and Eastern Railroad Company for use in logging operations by the company. As the 20th century advanced, so did the logging industry in the valley. In the 1910s, the North Bend Lumber Company began operating a sawmill in the company town of Edgewick, located in King County, which was named after the 2 owners of the company. The sawmill opened in 1911 and operated until 1918, when a flood destroyed the sawmill as well as several houses in the town. Mill operations ceased after the flood of 1918, when Edgewick was considered unsalvageable. The North Bend cable logging system was a specialized method of high-lead cable logging developed in the Pacific Northwest, particularly suited for steep and rugged terrain. It was named after the North Bend Lumber Company, where it was first implemented. What made it unique? Multiple skyline configurations. Unlike conventional high-lead logging, which used a single mainline and haulback system, the North Bend system often incorporated multiple skylines or intermediate supports to increase payload capacity and extend the reach of the rigging. Long-distance logging capability. This system was designed to move logs over long distances, including across valleys and difficult terrain where other systems would struggle. It allowed for efficient yarding of timber from otherwise inaccessible areas. Greater log control. The system provided more precise control over log movement, reducing ground disturbance and damage to the remaining forest, which made it more suitable for selective logging operations. Use of intermediate supports. In some variations, intermediate supports or jack trees are used to keep logs suspended higher off the ground, reducing friction and increasing the efficiency of the operation. Adaptability. It could be modified based on the logging site's needs, making it a versatile option compared to more rigid cable systems. Comparison to other rigging methods. Ground-based logging, e.g., skidders, was impractical due to the steep terrain in which North Bend was located. High-lead logging was more common but less efficient over long distances and lacked the control provided by the North Bend system. Skyline logging had similarities, but North Bend often employed more complex rigging configurations to achieve increased reach and log handling capabilities. This system was particularly beneficial in the heavily forested and mountainous regions of the Pacific Northwest, where traditional logging methods faced significant limitations. The South Fork Lumber Company, also known as Tanner Mill, operated a few miles up the road from North Bend on Sallow Prairie. Today, the location is within the city limits of North Bend. The mill burned down several times and was rebuilt over the years in slightly different locations, but operated from the early 1900s through the 1980s. A 1907 advertisement describes it thusly.
3 miles up the river from North Bend is the immense mill of L.B. Tanner. No expense was spared in the building of this plant to make it thoroughly up to date in every particular. Here, a timber 120 feet long and 8 feet square can be sawed, and timbers 32 inches square and any length dressed and loaded onto cars for shipment with perfect ease. The capacity is 100,000 feet per day, and 120 men are employed in the mill and woods, the monthly payroll being over $5,000. Lath and shingle mills are now being built. They are now installing a railroad to connect with some of the company's timber, located farther up the river.
In 1900, Weyerhaeuser purchased land in the Snoqualmie Valley that was checkerboarded with Rockefeller timber holdings. The need for building material following the San Francisco 1906 earthquake and fire triggered the purchase of the adjacent pieces of the checkerboard by the Grandin Coast Lumber Company. In 1914, Weyerhaeuser and Grandin Coast incorporated the Snoqualmie Falls Lumber Company to build the second all-electric mill in the nation, at Snoqualmie. It took 2 years to plan the mill and begin creating the surrounding mill town of Snoqualmie Falls, Washington. The mill town of Snoqualmie Falls grew to include 250 homes, a general store, a 50-bed hospital, a grade school, a community hall, YMCA, a railroad station, a barber shop, a boarding house, and a hotel. World War I created manpower and material shortages. Women were hired for some jobs traditionally held by men. Japanese nationals were recruited to build the logging railroad and were housed at the mill site. Wood was a primary strategic material for World War I, and ship timbers and airplane stock were the first items produced. The U.S. Army recruited soldiers to work in the woods and the mill under the auspices of the Spruce Production Board. There were 6 squadrons stationed in the valley, including at North Bend Timber Company and Snoqualmie Falls Lumber Company. Mill 1, built to handle 11-foot diameter Douglas fir, cut its first log on November 25, 1917. Mill 2, sized for western hemlock and western red cedar, opened on May 24, 1918. Electric chainsaws first came to the woods in 1939, gas in 1943. Logging trucks began operations in the 1930s. Cherry Valley Lumber Company. The O'Neill brothers of Stillwater, Minnesota, and Thomas Irvine Lumber Company of St. Paul, bought up the holdings of the Mosier and McDonald operations in Cherry Valley in 1901 and 1902. They filed articles of incorporation to form the Cherry Valley Logging Company. These operations were located north of the present-day town of Duval. On May 31, 1904, the company was reorganized as the Cherry Valley Logging and Railway Company. In 1907-08, the company started building another logging road from the Snoqualmie River into the woods a few miles north of Tolt, Carnation, and this road became known locally as the Stillwater Lumber Company. After a runaway log train incident on the Cherry Valley line in 1911, it was decided to close down operations there. Consequently, the rails were pulled up, and the equipment was moved to the Stillwater site in 1912 to expand those operations. 2 new companies were then formed, Cherry Valley Railway Company, on May 3, 1912, to purchase and operate the railroad properties, including the right-of-way, logging cars, locomotives, engine houses, and the log dump. The Cherry Valley Timber Company was formed on May 9, 1912, to oversee the actual logging operations, which included 13 donkey engines, a cookhouse, and a bunkhouse C, and other facilities. On May 20, 1912, The name of the Cherry Valley Logging and Railway Company was changed to Lake Joy Logging and Railway Company for purposes of the sale and to avoid confusion with the new Cherry Valley companies just formed. The Lake Joy operation was just a paper company and was dissolved on June 30, 1914. Monday, March 10, 1913, the company stopped dumping its logs into the Snoqualmie River and began shipping them over the Milwaukee Road branch through the valley to a new log dump, called Riverview, west of Snohomish. The Milwaukee Road provided 150 Tacoma Eastern flat cars equipped with turtle-back log bunks and provided a regular train out of Everett, called the Stillwater Logger, to handle the business. At its peak, Cherry Valley was shipping about 60 loads of logs daily. In December 1915, the Cherry Valley Railway's operations were absorbed by the Timber Company, and the entire operation was renamed the Cherry Valley Timber Company. Then, on July 6, 1916, the company reorganized one final time and emerged under the name Cherry Valley Logging Company, the same name it had used since 1902. By 1924, Cherry Valley was moving its operations to the Griffin Creek area south of Carnation, and in 1927, when Weyerhaeuser was opening up its Vail operations, Cherry Valley's equipment was moved there to expand those lines and woods operations. The last remnants of Cherry Valley's timber holdings were sold in 1939, and the company was formally dissolved in 1948. Harry Seiler began his logging activities in 1889 on the Stillaguamish River and later became the timber purchase overseer for the Port Blakely Mill Company. In 1916, the Florence Logging Company was formed by Seiler and several partners. It began operating in Snohomish County. When it closed in 1925, a new company, Seiler Logging Company, was formed under the direction of Seiler. He purchased the Florence Logging Company equipment. The Seiler Logging Company was jointly owned by Port Blakely Mill Company and Weyerhaeuser Timber Company, and they owned the majority of the land in King County that the Seiler Logging Company logged. As the land was logged, much of it was sold for development. At its peak in 1929, Seiler Logging Company employed approximately 200 workers, making it one of the largest operations in the region. However, the onset of the Great Depression in late 1929 led to a downturn in the lumber market, causing the company to cease operations in 1931. Subsequently, Weyerhaeuser acquired Seiler's equipment, including the Mikado locomotive, which was transferred to their Vail operation. Hundreds of logging and milling businesses operated in the Snoqualmie Valley during the last 150 years. The companies are too numerous to discuss further in this video, but include the following. Please notify the Snoqualmie Valley Museum if you are aware of a company that was omitted from this list and provide any details you have about it. In addition to railways and logging, hydroelectric power has also been a major industry in the Snoqualmie Valley. The Snoqualmie Falls Power Plant was built in 1898 as the first all-underground power plant in the world. The plant pioneered the use of alternating current, AC, to replace Edison's direct current, DC. The Snoqualmie Falls Power Plant, built by the Snoqualmie Falls Power Company, a subsidiary of Puget Sound Power and Light, now Puget Sound Energy, is one of the oldest hydroelectric plants in the United States. It was constructed between 1898 and 1899 and became the world's first completely underground hydroelectric facility. The plant was designed by Charles H. Baker, who saw the potential of using Snoqualmie Falls' 268-foot drop for power generation. The plant was constructed inside a 270-foot deep underground shaft, with water diverted through a tunnel to drive turbines. Initially, it produced around 10 megawatts of electricity, which was transmitted to Seattle, helping to power the city's early growth. A second powerhouse was later built in 1910 to expand capacity. With the construction of the power plant and all the logging activity, debris was regularly caught on the large rock that was so iconic at Snoqualmie Falls. This rock was blasted away in 1900 to help alleviate flooding issues in Snoqualmie and to relieve flooding in the pool for the intake at the power plant. A Snoqualmie tribe perspective.
When Charles Baker looked upon Snoqualmie Falls and felt what so many had before, he mistook that powerful energy as something that could be harnessed and sold. He desecrated our sacred site by blasting out the Snoqualmie Falls to build a hydroelectric facility that brought electricity to the growing city of Seattle by the end of the 1800s. The visible straightening of the fall's rock face forced-engineered this sacred site of the Snoqualmie people, the Snoqualmie Falls.
Another early hydroelectric project in the Snoqualmie Valley was at Cedar Falls. In the early 1900s, King County's population continued to expand. It grew by over 72% from 1890 to 110,053 in 1900, and then by another 158% from 1900 to 284,638 in 1910. With this increased growth, Seattle needed more power and water. There had been a small homestead community at Cedar Lake that was condemned to form the Seattle City Light Cedar Falls watershed. A multi-year project, the Seattle City Light Project dammed up the Cedar River, turning Cedar Lake into a larger version of Chester Morse Lake, providing water and power for countless Seattle residents. With the project, Seattle created a small town called Cedar Falls, also known as Moncton, until the spring of 1912, when the name formally changed to Cedar Falls, for the workers to live in. The town consisted of two parts: Camp 2 at the dam and a town at what is now Rattlesnake Lake and the Cedar Falls Watershed Education Center. As the project reached completion, Seattle filled up the lake behind their new dam. This changed the area water table. Within 3 years, this change in the water table destroyed two towns. In 1915, the water levels began to rise in the bowl that Cedar Falls town was built in, forming Rattlesnake Lake. Luckily, this flood was slow-moving, and the community had time to evacuate houses and salvage their belongings before the water reached each house. Edgewick would not be so lucky. In December 1918, there was a very rainy season and Seattle City Light allowed the dam to fill to its highest levels. On Christmas Eve 1918, this caused a complete saturation of one of the hillsides at the lake, and it gave way. The ensuing flood of water and debris swept down Boxley Creek and wiped out the town of Edgewick and the North Bend Timber Company mill. The people of Edgewick had been aware that something was not quite right with nature, and luckily had posted a night watchman. He heard the sound of the hillside coming down Boxley Canyon and blew the mill whistle to warn the town of the impending disaster. Miraculously, no one was killed. The next morning, the town of North Bend awoke to debris from the homes floating down the river and rushed up the valley to lend a hand. Additional hydroelectric facilities were later built in multiple areas around the valley, including in the Tolt watershed and up Snoqualmie Pass. Mining is a less perceived industry in the Snoqualmie Valley, but it has played an essential role in bringing investment to the community early on. The first gold discovery in the Cascade Range was likely made on the Yakima River by George McClellan's men during the Pacific Railroad survey in the early 1850s. In King County, a prospecting party led by Seattle pioneer Arthur Denny pushed up into the mountains near the upper reaches of the Cedar River drainage around 1865, looking for the source of lead shown to them by some of the Snoqualmie people. The major mineral-producing and coal-producing areas of King County were primarily located in the far eastern part of the county, including the Miller River, Money Creek, Buena Vista, Snoqualmie, and Cedar River districts. Small groups of claimants initiated these early efforts, but over time, a few larger mining companies, often with Eastern investors, came to dominate the industry. The Snoqualmie district, like others throughout the Cascades, was dependent on the advent of transportation for the sustained development of mining. The Snoqualmie Wagon Road was the first point of access for many of the early claims, and later, a portion of the Seattle, Lakeshore, and Eastern promised connections to smelters or coastal shipping facilities. Arthur Denny is credited with the first exploratory venture in this district, following information provided by some of the Snoqualmie people in the late 1860s. Denny located some iron ore in the vicinity of a peak later named Denny Mountain, but did not improve his claims at that time. He returned in the early 1880s with other Seattleites to further explore 3 iron ledges and to file at least 9 additional claims that led to the establishment of the Denny Iron Mines Company in 1882. The mines were considered promising enough to supply a new smelter and steel mill under construction by Peter Kirk on Lake Washington in 1891 and 1892, but work on the claims stopped quickly when Kirk's venture collapsed during the economic panic of 1893. Francis M. Guy and other members of his family made several other promising iron ore claims. A mile-long trail split off from the Snoqualmie Wagon Road at Snoqualmie Pass to the Guy Iron Mine, located near what became known as Guy Mountain. Guy, an Indiana native who had crossed the Great Plains and then prospected at Placerville in California before following the Fraser River Gold Rush, came to Puget Sound in 1859. After several failed business attempts, Guy returned to mining, and filed at least 7 prospecting claims around the Snoqualmie Valley in the 1890s. The Green Mountain group of iron ore claims was about 6 miles from Sallow Prairie between the north and middle forks of the Snoqualmie River. The Buena Vista district was located up the north fork of the Snoqualmie River, and at the time was considered an extension of the Money Creek and Miller River. The district developed more slowly because of its difficult access, 25 miles from the nearest railroad, on 19 miles of road, and then a long series of trails. Small outside investors developed many of these mining properties, including the Mastodon Group, funded by British Columbia residents, and the Arizona and Washington claims, filed by the Arizona Gold Mining Company. Seattle brewer Andrew Hemrick was also a partner in a series of claims in the district called the Fletcher-Webster Group. The Cedar River District included at least 29 mining claims, and unlike some of the other districts, was primarily developed by Seattle prospectors and investors. To reach the area, miners could ride the SLS&E, then known as the Seattle and International, to North Bend, where they followed a wagon road to the confluence of the Cedar River and Bear Creek. At this point, trails along each of these waterways led to the mineral claims. Most were small operations, but the Robinson Mining Company, which had patented the Mary Earhart mine, made a more substantial development. Despite the networks of tunnels and shafts throughout the area, most of these mining operations were never commercially successful. Of all the mining opportunities in the area, coal was probably the most critical resource in the early development of King County. Much of the first production was exported to California and other destinations, while some was used locally for both residential and industrial purposes. Steam generation, particularly for both maritime and railroad transportation, ultimately became its primary use and prompted the outright purchase of several mines by railroad and transportation interests. Like other mining settlements, most coal mining communities were ultimately ephemeral. However, a few persisted, despite the exhaustion of resources and major changes in their original industrial base. From the 1890s through at least the 1920s, the Niblock mine operated near Snoqualmie as the easternmost end of the coal seams that ran through Rent, Newcastle, and Issaquah. In 1925, the California-Alaska Corporation was operating the Niblock mine, which was extracting coal from two seams located near today's I-90 exit 27, just outside Snoqualmie city limits. This colliery was operated on and off by a series of 3 successive operators over a period of almost 40 years. Still, it never achieved any of the success found in the West in the mines of Issaquah, Newcastle, and Renton. In addition to these industries, farming was and is the other major industry in the Snoqualmie Valley. Join us next time for Foodways and Farming, Snoqualmie Valley History 101 Part 5. For more information about Snoqualmie Valley history, visit Snoqualmie Valley Museum in person Thursday through Tuesday, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. or online at snoqualmievalleymuseum.org. The museum is closed Wednesdays and federal holidays.